Hi, welcome back to my channel, Quest for Faith with Brian. And today I got a special guest, Drew from Drew the Catholic. Super excited to have you on, buddy. We were
Thanks,
talking
man.
before we started recording, and I don't think I've watched all yours, but I've watched a number of your videos, especially I'll have them playing while I'm doing work in the house. That's typically how I do my YouTube binging,
Oh
is
yeah,
I'm mowing
same.
the lawn and I'll throw headsets on and listen to talks, and
Right.
that's
That's
usually
the
how
way
I
to
do
do it.
things.
That's the way. It's cool to watch every once in a while, but yeah, I'm the same way. I just plop in the headphones and kind of wash dishes or clean up the house or whatever it is. Yeah.
Yeah, for
Cool.
sure. So yeah, I'm really excited to have you on, and I think, yeah, this is going to be a fun conversation. I think for both of us. I'm hoping so.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, definitely.
Awesome. So let's kind of start off because you're a convert too,
Yep.
and I've watched your conversion story, and I think there's a lot of you definitely were on the path of a little more in depth than I was at an earlier age in your life. So because
Sure.
I even though I went to Abilene Christian University, and I had to
Okay.
take Bible, but that wasn't my major. So
Right. Right.
so but yeah, let's kind of start off with your early faith life. Like, what was that like? Where did it all kind of begin with you growing up?
Yeah. Um, Growing up there was a couple different things going on faith wise. As far as my immediate family goes, I would describe us as sort of like your Creaster Christians, Christmas, Easter only, right?
Hmm.
Um, and so my mom had a loose Church of Christ background, which I think
Yep.
that's
Yeah.
your background as
I
well,
grew up
right?
Church of Christ. Yeah.
Yeah. And then her parents were both Church of Christ and ended up kind of more Methodist, I guess, but
Hmm.
not with any real devotion or allegiance to those denominations. It was just kind of like where they went sometimes. And that was similar to us, but instead of any particular mainstream denomination, it was kind of the hip evangelical church in our town. So we'd go there occasionally, and I remember growing up, it felt like at various times we'd be going more often, maybe sometimes outside of the major holidays when life was getting tough or, when they felt like they needed to. And then things would get good or they felt like they didn't need to and we wouldn't really be going to church. So that was sort of like internal to my household. And my parents believed in God, they believed in Jesus to some extent. But it wasn't, I wouldn't say, and I think they would be, okay with me characterizing it this way. It wasn't like sold out. They weren't on
Hmm.
fire. They weren't, having Bible studies at their house or anything like that. It was sort of a loose Christian affiliation, just enough to make you feel good when you need it. And when, like if someone dies in the family or whatever, to make you feel comforted, but not enough to be like life changing or drive your life. That being said, when I was in second grade, they did start sending me to a Catholic school.
Okay.
Just for the educational component, there was some things going on in the schools in our area and things they were seeing in my older brother's education. And they're like, yeah, we want him to be in a place that's, higher standards, and that will, form him to be, more disciplined person and stuff. And so they sent me to Catholic school. And so then I was going to religion class, once a day from second grade to eighth grade. And that was interesting, right? Because then my family, is the same Christmas, Easter at the evangelical church, but I'm going to mass like once a week
Yeah.
and studying Catholicism in that age, which is like very low, right? Very
Right.
low
It's like what
level.
my kids are studying now. So yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Like we're reading Bible stories with like picture art and stuff. And I remember at that time, same sort of thing. Like I would say at that time, maybe I took Jesus a little more seriously than my family,
Hmm.
but didn't have what I would call like the classic like conversion experience.
Right.
I just knew God was important. And I knew we weren't Catholic, which was weird because I didn't get to take communion, and I felt kind of left out in that. There was one point where I actually wanted to become Catholic, but it is kind of funny. And in hindsight, I'm glad they did this, but they were like, no, you shouldn't just do that. You should wait a little bit, which I don't know. Maybe they should have been like, yeah, make him Catholic now and save him 20 years. Um, but I just wanted mostly to do it for, to fit in at that point.
Yeah.
Didn't really know why I would be doing it. So I think that's why they told me like, no, you're not, you're not there yet, buddy. But that was my formation mostly growing up. So there was this idea that God was important and Jesus had something to do with that. And whether it was Catholic or evangelical, as long as you kind of knew that and were a decent person, that's all you needed. That's kind of, I would say, like the religious formation that I had.
Okay. So what do you think that early Catholic, because I know you started from your story, and we can kind of dive into this next. Like, you started taking your faith a lot more seriously. Was that more in high school is when that started happening? And you
Yeah.
think that going to Catholic school and going to mass daily kind of triggered that more for you than it
Hmm.
did, since your parents weren't experiencing that at that point? Um,
Yeah, I think so. I think it played a role for sure. What basically happened that made me a sold out sort of evangelical Christian in high school, because that's where my faith journey really started. There was a lot of stuff going on. I mean, obviously, so I was in high school around the 2008 financial crisis. And so
okay.
there was a lot of financial stuff going on, a lot of hardship in our family, in our extended family as well, and just everywhere around us. We ended up, as a result of that, moving to Phoenix, Arizona from Colorado, which is actually where I live again now. So I started over a new school in high school, had to make all new friends, and was really like the move for me was a big struggle trying to figure out my place, because I was coming from a place where smaller community, well known, had good friends, had good connections, had a good school that I went to, and now all that changed and it's much bigger and scarier. And I
Yeah.
think as a family we struggled with that, especially on the cusp of a financial crisis that's like affecting the whole country. And then that kind of became one of those times where my parents started seeking again. And there was this little church plant in an elementary school, like right down the road from our house. And my dad was like, "Yeah, maybe we should start going to church again." He had read this book about um, bitterness and
Hmm.
like the spiritual fruit of bitterness and how it can like destroy your life. And he was like, "Wow, this sounds like me in the financial crisis right now. So we need to let this go
Yeah.
and
I got
start
laid off
taking."
twice because of that financial crisis, so I feel
Right.
you.
Yeah, you feel the pain. Yeah, I mean, it hit everybody, right? It was a detrimental moment for sure. But I mean, that's kind of how that stuff goes. A lot of people, that's the moment that they almost need in a way to start
Mhm.
thinking about these things. And for my dad, that kind of happened. We started going to church more regularly than we ever really had. And I think for me, I've always been pretty philosophically inclined. And so having something deep and meaningful beyond just like, oh, do good in school and get a neat job, that was meaningful. So I started going to youth group, and then I started going to Young Life, just because that was the thing that, well, actually, my mom forced me to go to Young Life because she's like, you got to do something. Because I didn't want to
Yeah.
do like a bunch of sports clubs. And she's like, okay, well, you got to at least try Young Life, and you're liking youth group. So it's like that. And I would say that those experiences really made me take Christianity seriously, and that's sort of where my formation started. But looking back on it, I think the Catholic education I had played a role in that, because I was already open to God to some extent. I just didn't know that I needed to take it really seriously and make it the
Right.
center of my life yet. Um, but I will say I think it formed my character in a lot of ways. Like looking back on my Catholic school experience and then looking how my life has played out, the way that it formed me as a person, definitely, yeah, definitely played out. But in terms of like theology and taking religion seriously, that wasn't really on the map yet from Catholic school. But yeah, Young Life and all of those youth group experiences really started to make that happen for me. So,
Yeah, I did Young Life
yeah.
in high school too,
Okay.
and, it for me, I was already going to church 3 days a week, all the time. Like, I
Sure.
always was just involved. So, Young Life for me was more to hang out with, girls that were interested, who were halfway Christian and
Yep.
were cute, right? I mean,
That's part of it.
that's why I went to Young Life. And so, but it was always interesting for me because I just had and I don't know where you're at that point with Young Life, but it was like very superficial conversations about Christ
Definitely.
to get you to go to camp. And then they'd have the
Yes.
big
Yes.
conversations at camp.
The camp cell. Yep.
Yeah. And
Yep.
which I love those camps. Like, I think I went 3 years in a row, and then I did volunteer
Mhm.
work in college to go to one of the camps.
What camp did you go to?
Oh Lord, it was in Northern California. We went to one. I cannot
Oh,
Woodleaf.
yes, I've been to Woodleaf. Okay. So
Okay,
I
with the
I led
zip line
wildlife in college.
into
Yep.
the pool. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
we went.
so that's great.
Yeah, we went to that one in high school 3 times, and then that's
Okay.
where I spent a summer as a cook volunteering,
Oh,
and
okay.
then and we also went to one up in Oregon, which
Yeah, I
which
don't remember what
I
that
can't
one
remember the name
is.
of that one, but it's in Eastern Oregon, and so
Right.
it's out in the desert, and it's
Yep.
creepy because you're literally out in the middle of nowhere, and it used to be owned by a cult, and so the cult went
Yeah,
crazy, and the
it was
government took
Washington
over the
Family
land.
Ranch or something, wasn't
Yeah,
it?
yeah.
I remember when
Yep.
Yeah, I remember that camp. I never went to it, but we almost went to it, and that I remember that being like the buzz that got around, like, "Oh, we're gonna go to an ex-cult camp or whatever," and then all the
Yeah.
parents were like, "What? Where are
Yeah,
we
like, I
going?"
was a leader and took kids up to that camp,
Okay, yeah.
and then I flew down from Oregon down to Sacramento, then to go out to it was Woodleaf, right? Yeah.
Yep, yeah, Woodleaf was the one in California, yeah. I went there in college. I led wildlife for a little over a year, and that was a
Okay.
summer camp we went to. And then I think my first one was in Colorado, and then Lost Canyon was the one in Arizona that we went to a lot because I was in Arizona at the time. And so I was there for winter camp every year. And then I did a work crew as well at Lost Canyon. I was in the pits, which,
Okay.
man, that was rough.
Yeah.
We had the worst job. Everyone else they served, breakfast, lunch, dinner, and then went on and did their stuff, and we were in the pits felt like 10 hours a day.
Yeah, like, I
So,
had the morning shift for cooking,
okay.
and so I'd have to get up at 4 a.m. to cook
Yeah.
breakfast for the camp, and then
That's
it was
brutal.
just awful. But,
Oh
I mean, it
man.
was good experience for a young guy that's, I mean, had a pretty plush life up to that
Right.
point.
Right.
But yeah, so for Young Life for me, it was fun. Um, but I didn't really get that much fruit out of it because I felt
Mhm.
like for me it was kind of a weird experience because I felt like I already had more answers than other people. So I would be starting to be asked questions. And I'm like, can you explain this more to me? And then
Right.
I was not prepared for that at all. But what was kind of that catalyst that made you like really go, because that's you got your degree in theology, right?
Yeah, yeah, I got my bachelor's degree in that. I think what happened was a couple things. So first off, like we had a really good crew at Young Life. Um, Me and a bunch of other buddies all kind of really dove into it head first. And we were doing club on Mondays, we were doing the Bible study on Thursdays. We all became junior leaders, and we just had a solid crew. And I think outside of that, we started going to like two different youth groups. So like we had
That's awesome.
this crew of church kids, and there was like probably 5 or 6 of us that was like hitting up two different youth groups and Young Life, just super involved. So I think that was pivotal. And then like the church that my dad and I had been going to, he had gotten pretty involved there, and I was really close with the youth pastor there. So I just had all these experiences with really dynamic leaders. And one of the big things that we got lucky with is our Young Life leader was also the area director, and he which this isn't required to be an area director. He was getting his master's degree in theology from St. Andrews in Scotland.
Wow.
Amazingly smart guy. And I
Yeah.
asked him, I'm like, are you like wanting to be a professor? Or are you wanting to like go be a pastor or like write books? And he was like, no, I just want to be better formed so that I can disciple people better. He ultimately ended up becoming a professor though. So
Yeah.
he still does Young Life. Great guy. Sean, if you ever see this, shout out, man. But it just great formation and like youth pastors and stuff that were really on fire. And I think, yeah, I got baptized. I think it was my junior year of high school at one of the youth groups we were going to. And I got baptized by my youth pastor from the other church we were going to. Like they kind of did like a crossover thing to make that happen, which was cool. So all of that just made me really excited about my faith. And I knew there was something there, and I knew I wanted to know more. But I think what really did it, because like that was just good community, good fun, and it was like giving me something that was meaningful in life. Because everyone in high school, I think, has that like existential crisis of like, what are we here for? What makes life worth it and all that. And I really wrestled with a lot of that stuff. I was pretty angsty in high school, and that was giving me something for sure to chew on and like give me meaning. But I really had a crisis of faith, I think, my senior year. It started probably summer going into my senior year. um, it's kind of funny to like be really specific about it. I encountered my first like really zealous atheist in life.
Mm,
Just someone I ended up having a discussion with that was, not just like, oh yeah, I don't believe there's a God, whatever, no big deal, but like really had good reasons for it, was, argumentative about it, and challenged me a lot. And so then I kind of had this moment where I was like, whoa, like, does any of this make sense? Like, it makes emotional sense and it makes me feel good, but like, is it true? Is it scientifically verifiable? Um, so then I kind of went down that journey. And for a while, I really was like torn. I was like, man, like evolution seems really convincing. Like, what do I do about Genesis? And I didn't have anyone to synthesize how you could reconcile those two, or
yeah.
anything like that. So, um, that was the year that I had a lot of those challenges. And then ultimately, one of my really good friends handed me Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. Um,
Great book.
Absolutely fantastic. And it saved my faith in some really important ways that year, in that I finally found something that was a reasonable defense of the basics of Christianity, at least philosophically.
Right.
And then I went on like an apologetics like deep dive. I just would binge read apologetics books. And I'm, like William Lane Craig, just to the max all the time,
Hmm.
listening to debates. And like really I was just like, can someone like prove to me that Richard Dawkins is wrong?
Right.
Um and that became there was a lot of like emotional attachment to those answers. I'm like, I either have to be a Christian or I have to be an atheist. Like it's got to be one or the other. And ultimately, like, yeah, just binging apologetics, I was like, whoa, there's a lot of good defenses for, God in general, and then Christianity in specific, the resurrection. There's a lot of different ways to argue positively for that. And you don't have to do it in a way that skirts around the objections people have. Like, you can really reasonably hold to this, and
Right.
it makes
And hit it head
intellectual
on.
sense. Yeah, yeah. And that was huge for me because I realized that, like, wait, this whole idea that like what science might be discovering and faith are incompatible, like that's a myth. They can be totally reconciled,
Oh
like what
yeah.
science has proven,
I
and
mean,
faith.
even the
Yeah.
a priestess who came up with the Big Bang Theory,
Yeah,
like,
exactly. Yeah.
and I
Yes.
love that when the story I heard was that when Einstein heard his talk in London, he gave a presentation on the Big Bang Theory and why he thought what it was. Einstein
Mhm.
was even like, "No, he's right," and
Yep.
like conceded the point.
Yeah, yeah. I think it was Father George Lemaitre or something
Hmm.
like that. Yeah, my wife studied him a lot because she studied environmental science and did a lot of work with like astronomy and stuff too. Um, yeah, right. So that you realize there's all this like reasonable ways to hold to the faith, and you don't have to make concessions or just say, oh well, it doesn't make sense, but I'm just going to believe it. And then ultimately, I was really passionate about sharing that stuff because I realized there were other people who maybe weren't as willing to like do the work of reading those books, but
Yeah.
had those questions, and if they had answers, would be like open to being like, okay, maybe I should take this Jesus guy a little more seriously. And that's what led me to ultimately pick my degree in college. Because originally I was like, yeah, I'm gonna go to University of Arizona and study economics and join a frat. Like I had that dumb idea for about 5 minutes,
Oh,
enough
I
time
stuck
to
with that
actually
idea.
sign up. But then all of that made me kind of change my mind. I'm like, wait, here I am, in my free time reading a ton of books, and it's not like economics books or like business books. It's theology and
Yeah.
apologetics. And so I was like, maybe I should study this and maybe I should be a pastor. And I kind of started thinking about that. And around that time, I had other people telling me, like, dude, have you considered ministry? And I was like, maybe I should. So then, yeah, I ultimately signed up to go to Grand Canyon University and study. It's called their Christian Studies program, but it's
Hmm.
basically like a bachelor's in theology and Christian history.
Yeah, I started, so when I went to ACU, because I went to junior college my freshman year and then transferred to ACU.
Mhm.
Um, and when I was there, I had that inkling of maybe I should at least get a minor in Bible, or
Sure.
my grandfather was a Church of Christ preacher. He's
Mhm.
retired since COVID, but he's 89 now.
Oh,
So
wow.
he preached all the way through mostly his 80s. Um, but yeah, it was something I thought of, but at the time, I didn't feel I had the chops for it.
Sure.
And I think just with maturity, because most of the other Bible kids that I knew that were getting their degrees were the holding their nose up in the air, "We're better than you" type,
There was a lot of that.
and it
Yeah.
just rubbed me the wrong way, and I was just like,
Yeah.
"Okay, I can't hang with these guys." And so I think that's kinda what pushed me away from it, but
Sure.
so you decide to go get your degree in theology. So yeah, when did the Catholic stuff start leaking in to your thought process? And I because I could just imagine no matter what theology books, the further you go back, the more you're like, oh wait, that's a Catholic thing.
Yeah, it's funny. So the university I went to was historically Baptist, but by the time I got there, it says Grand Canyon University in Phoenix, and they had a really diverse theology college in terms of professors, within Protestantism at least. So we
Mhm.
had a lot of Baptists from the old days, And then we had a good number, like we had 2 or 3 Anglicans, a couple Pentecostals, a lot of evangelicals, we had 1 Presbyterian. So we
Okay.
had like sort of at least in terms of Protestantism.
Hodgepodge.
Yeah, exactly. And so that was helpful. At the time, I was going to a church that was typical evangelical sort of Baptist with a good website. That's what I always call it, type of church. And they were Reformed theology, so they would have been, Calvinist in their soteriology, and that's basically where I was going into college. Um, and so for a while, like the first 2 years, I would say it was just kind of getting the basics down. Like we were taking our intro to New Testament, intro to Old Testament, hadn't done church history yet. That wasn't until like the very end of our degree program. So it was just getting comfortable with the basics of, sort of a generic,
Yeah.
wide range acceptable Protestant confession of faith. And um within that, the main struggles I had was like, oh, is Calvinism true? And I think the big thing that happened is I took systematic theology from an Anglican, um, who was he was kind of a bulldog in the best way. Like he loved to make you challenge your assumptions. And so the whole point of his class in a way was like, hey, you grew up a confessional Baptist. Here's why that might be wrong. Have you thought about that? Like he made you kind of, I don't want to say doubt your upbringing, but really would challenge you with like really good arguments from other denominations. He's like,
Yeah.
by the way, here's Orthodoxy. Have you ever even heard of these guys? And that made my world like go like this, like widen a ton. Cause I was like, oh, there's all these different denominations that land in very different points. And the other big thing he did is he turned me on to NT Wright. I think that's kind of ultimately what's responsible for like the Catholicism kind of eking in, because that just made the New Testament come alive to me. Like when I started studying what they call the new perspective on Paul and reading the New Testament through the lens of what would a first century Jew have thought about this,
Yeah.
Then we start taking those history classes and like learning about that era. And I'm like, wait, all of these verses that just, go right over everyone's head. If you look at it in context and the culture, some of that stuff comes alive in really beautiful ways. And so probably like the bulk of my education was just becoming obsessed with that method of reading scripture and like, how can I read this as if it was written like directly to me and I was alive in that time? And that made me basically Anglican, I would say, mostly because of that professor. Like I got really close
Right.
with him. But it just broadened me, and I don't know that I would have considered Catholicism at that point. I would have been like, yeah, we should take, church history maybe more seriously. But like, I still probably had a negative view of Catholicism.
Yeah.
It is probably the church history class that did that, because we started reading some of that stuff. And it's funny in hindsight, looking back on it, I'm like, we didn't read a ton of it, if that makes sense. Like they were like, yeah,
Mhm.
here's like the first, what we call the ante-Nicene fathers. Here's the flyby of the post-Nicene fathers. And then, okay, we're at the Reformation, as quick as we can get
Yes.
there.
Wait, 1 second. Let me grab something real quick. 1 sec.
Dude, that's the textbook. That's the textbook I used. I've had that book. Is that church history by,
Awful.
yep. Yeah.
So he's from my alma mater, the guy who wrote
Oh,
this.
really? Okay.
And so when I was questioning everything, and we could, I could come on your channel and talk about my story,
Yeah,
but
we should do that.
I completely realized that I didn't agree with anything Martin Luther did, like about
Yeah,
taking out the Bible. I was like,
right.
I don't know if he's right or not, but his logic about why he removed the created the Apocrypha didn't make
Right.
sense to me. And so I was like, I need to read like the early church fathers. Like I need to figure this
Yep.
out. And so I went to like a normal, Christian bookstore, and I'm looking through that, and I find this book and I bring it home, and then I open it up and realize it's an Abilene Christian University professor that wrote it.
Mhm.
So it's a Church of Christ perspective on early church fathers.
Oh, that's funny.
It's awful.
It
It has
Yes.
no references to anything. It's just assumptions and
Yep.
opinions. And I've got
Yeah.
my master's, and I've written a work on, I've done academic writing.
Sure.
You have to back up everything you say with a reference from something, because it can't be your own opinions.
Right.
And that's what I was hoping to get out of that. And I'm
And it's
reading
not.
through this, and I'm like,
It's
and
yeah.
there's no appendix. Like there's
Right.
nothing. I'm like,
Yeah.
this is what Church of Christ kids are reading to become preachers. Like this is
Mhm.
awful. Anyways, so
That's funny because
go
I bought that book. It wasn't our official textbook for class. I don't know if it was in like a recommended reading or something, but I read that book on my own, and that formed a lot of my opinions for a bit. And then in our class, we read Church History by Bruce Shelley, which is
Okay.
it's better. It's still not like, I wouldn't say it's great now. It's like it got a very clear Protestant bias to it.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, that book I've spent a lot of time in. So as soon as I saw the spine as you were carrying it over, and I was like, oh no, I
Yeah.
know where we're
Well,
going. Oh man, yeah, because then he has a whole series, and when you get to the Reformation, it's like, oh,
right.
it's like the lights came on for the first time.
Yeah,
Um,
because at the point when I was reading that, I knew if I didn't agree with Luther and I needed a church that had the full Bible, it was either Orthodox or Catholic. And I was just
Absolutely.
praying it wasn't going to be Catholic
Yeah,
at that point.
that's what always happens.
But I'm reading it, and like when he's talking about the uh, Peter being the first pope, it's like, well, there's no real proof that he was a bishop in Rome, even though he was there at the same time. Like he's leaves it open that maybe Paul was the bishop in Rome. And I'm
Sure,
like,
right.
where is your
Just
proof of that?
baseball,
Like, I need the
right?
evidence to not make me Catholic. I need it. And there's nothing
Yeah,
there.
and then you're like disappointed, and you're like, no, I got to enter RCIA.
Yeah, I got to figure this out on my own. But, anyways,
Yep,
okay, sorry.
yep. Oh no, you're good. Yeah, yeah. So I'm trying to think. Yeah, so I mean, I would say that door to Catholicism was maybe it was starting to like become an option. Actually, yeah, I would say my senior year is probably the first time I was like, maybe Catholicism isn't entirely just a load of junk. And at that time, I had stopped going to the church I had gone to through most of college, because at that point I was like, okay, I'm no longer a Calvinist. I don't really think that there's historical approach to theology. They don't care about that at all. And there's a lot of like theological disagreement. So I left that church and started going to this professor's Anglican church. And it was a very small little plant, but he was just a cool guy. And I started praying Anglican morning prayer and got some Anglican prayer beads. And then that's when I kind of realized, I'm like, okay, I need, like, just from a purely psychological standpoint, I need something that's like rooted like this, that has rhythms that I can enter into. So then I got really into spiritual disciplines and all that, and I'm still horrible at them. So it's like an
Yeah.
ever evolving need, because I'm just so inconsistent with that stuff. But it was so good for me. And I would say at that point, I was like internally, at least, like, I don't know, like truth or history or whatever, like what we need to be, but I know internally I need to practice my faith as an Anglican at the time, is what I thought. That being said, I immediately graduated and started this internship at a more charismatic church that I had started kind of going to with some friends. And so it's, same thing I always did. I was kind of double dipping at church and going to this Anglican church for myself, but then going to this other church for friends. And it was really engaging. They were evangelizing well, it was growing. And they did this internship program. This is where it starts getting really juicy in terms of Catholicism, because it's like a D school for YWAM. Like, if you are you familiar with YWAM at
No.
all? So YWAM is called Youth with a Mission. It's like this. It's kind of like missions trips, and they do this 6-month discipleship training school before you go. Then you go on mission somewhere. This church,
Okay.
their whole model was kind of that. Like, when someone gets really plugged in, send them through a 6-month D school before they can like serve at higher up things in the church. And I was like, oh well, maybe this is where I start ministry, is at this church,
Right.
and then
Which isn't a
ultimately go
bad
plan.
idea. That way everyone's on
Right.
the same page.
Right.
If it's the
Yeah.
right page.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Got to get the right page, though. That's the thing. So, anyways, yeah, I was doing the D school, and it's funny because here I am with a theology degree, and I have all this, like, I've been just like chewing through like dense, N.T. Wright books on the new perspective on Paul, and on New Testament history, and on, the Jewish roots of this and that, mostly like nothing from Brant Pitre or anything at this point, but that's like really forming my theology. And then my practical experience at a charismatic church was like really rich because I had all of that background. But the people running the D school didn't even have theology degrees, hadn't gone to seminary. So there was starting to be this like tension almost of like, they would say something, and I wasn't trying to be rude and be like, actually, like the whole internet,
Right.
like,
You weren't being
actually,
that guy.
I was trying not to be like, I was trying to keep my mouth shut. But I feel like when you study the Bible and then someone in the room finds out that you've done it, they like start asking me questions, what happened. And so then people are asking me questions, and then I'm like, well, some people view it this way and this way. And like, I almost get professorial, and that created some animosity, I think, at this, like, just between me and the guy leading the school.
Yeah.
And I was like really trying to be respectful and just like not do that to him. but it just kind of became the dynamic of our class, where people would be like, "Hey, well, Drew, what do you think about that?" And I'd be like, well, like I'll like one example. Um, we had one of our executive pastors, also no theological background. He just had a finance background, so like executive pastor, handle the finances, and he was doing the teaching on like the Old Testament. And at the very end of it, this lady raises her hand that's in our class, and she's like, "What about the Jews? Are they saved?" And he was like, uh, he just stood there for a second, and then she looked at me. She's like, "Drew, what about the Jews?" And I was like, okay. So then I went into like the whole thing of, the people who had faith looking forward to the Messiah, have a reasonable hope, and Jesus descended to talk to them, and went into that whole dialogue. And so there was sort of like this tension was growing. And at this time, my personal devotion with like the spiritual disciplines is growing in such a way that it's looking very Anglican, right? To say the
Mhm.
least. Like I'm really into Lectio Divina. I'm really into Anglican prayer beads and like repetitive prayers. I wouldn't have prayed a rosary at that time, but I was like, I see why beads can help you like track prayers. I see why
Right.
repetitive prayer isn't bad and it's really helpful. And then I started to have this like this gnawing sense that liturgy that I was experiencing at this Anglican church wasn't just like a preference, but was almost necessary. And so all of that was kind of building. And at that same moment, I'm like, okay, I need to go deeper into church history. So I'm like beginning that journey of like starting to look at the fathers, because I'm like, okay, Anglicanism at its best claims a root to the patristic era. This is what they
Yeah.
would, what my, the Anglicans I knew were saying. And so all this is like synthesizing in my mind. I'm like in this discipleship program causing a ruckus, and like internally I'm fully Anglican. And I think where it came to a head, and this is what really said I got to figure this out and like do church history to the max, is we came to this point where they wanted us to do like a presentation. So this is kind of like school in a sense,
Right.
right? And we had to do a presentation on a revivalist, so it's a charismatic church. They're very into like, how do we get the next tent revival going? And they gave you a list of options. And they've probably changed the list after this, honestly, because
The Drew clause.
yeah, the Drew clause. Yeah. Cause so on the list was like classics, like John Wesley. There was, oh gosh, the guy who started the Vineyard movement, John Wimber, I think his name is.
Mhm.
And there's Smith Wigglesworth. I don't know if you've ever heard of this
Yeah.
guy. Interesting fella. So there's like all these classic like revivalist, Jonathan Edwards. And then at the bottom of the list is Francis of Assisi. And I was like, whoa, hey, that's cool. Like that's not your classic, post
Right.
1700s revivalist. So I'm going to pick him, of course, because I'm like nerdy Bible context history guy. And I, at that point, was ecumenical enough to be like, yo, St. Francis was a Catholic. So, like, I'm not going to shy away from that in my presentation. So, my presentation was titled St. Francis of Assisi. And I got all the content from, the little flowers of St. Francis. I talked about how he, saw a vision of the church and wanted to rebuild it, how he, like, gave up all of his possessions and was really radical, how he was, this was the turning point in the presentation, was like how his ministry was approved by the Pope, and that was the dirtiest word I could have said in that church, I think. And then at the end, I was like, yeah, and he was so holy that he, saw visions of Jesus and Mary and had the stigmata, which is like the wounds of Christ, and then he died. And so the room is like, I finished this presentation that's just like oozing with
Using
Catholicism.
Catholicism. Right.
Yeah, because I was like, he's a Catholic. Like, yeah, why are we so, I'm not going to shy away from that. Because I'm just trying to do good history and like be a genuine
Accurate.
scholar. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so there's like this silence, and I'm like, oh no, they like don't like my presentation. And then this hand shoots up, and it's one of the girls in the class, not the one that asked me to explain the Jews, a different girl. And she was like, well, why do Catholics pray to saints? And I was like, uh, and I had, at this point, I had been like researching enough to know that like, well, they, it's why would you, I looked at her, I said, why would I ask you to pray for me? She's like, because intercession is powerful. And I was like, well, there you go. And like, they're in heaven. So how much better would that be? That's the Catholic
Right.
view on it. And then the leader of the school is like, well, that doesn't work because they're dead and necromancy is condemned according to the Old Testament. So all of a sudden this turns into a crossfire, and I'm defending the Catholic faith. And I'm like, dude, I'm not even Catholic. But then I looked at him and I was like, I'm not Catholic, but actually, they are alive in Christ, because the book of Revelation shows them in front of the tomb. And we know that you can communicate with the dead because it happens with Samuel, obviously in a bad way in the Old Testament,
Right.
but that means it's at least possible. They're not like soul sleeping, you know? And so he was fuming mad. I felt attacked. I was like, why am I defending something I don't even believe? And then this is the funny part. I found out years later that one of the ladies that helped run the school went home to her husband and was like, should we be praying to saints? Like was like distraught over it. So I really caused a ruckus, I guess, with this presentation. And I genuinely,
That
maybe
wasn't your intent.
it wasn't my intent. I was just like, I'm just gonna do good schoolwork on it, you know? And so then I had this meeting with this guy, and it was bad. He was like, he was very convinced that Catholics were definitely not Christians. And at this point, I was like, no, they're not right, but they're Christians at least, you know? And I ended up leaving the school early over that, the discipleship training school. And I ended up leaving the church just because the way that they started kind of treating me after that wasn't really great. And that's a whole other
Yeah.
component to it. But ultimately I was like, well, if I feel this strongly about at least being ecumenical with these people, and this church isn't that way, then I can't really be on board here and be in ministry because,
Right.
yeah, they don't share that. And then there's this gnawing sense in the back of my head that's like, but also, I should probably look into Catholicism more if I'm gonna like agree that they're Christian and like they have some things right. And at this point, I'm going, and they're liturgical and have all these beautiful practices that are benefiting my life. So, and I think that was the turning point because then I was like, okay, now I'm like pretty much only reading things that are Anglican, Orthodox, or Catholic from that point on.
Right.
Yeah. So that's the really like heated moment, I guess, that kind of shoved me into what became a multiple year journey from that point on.
So so it took a few years after that because I think when did you start RCIA?
So we were received into the church in 2021. Not a traditional RCIA experience at all. Probably the very end of 2020, like seriously, like in December, we started meeting with the religious education director at
Okay.
our current parish.
Yeah, because I'm around the same time. Like we started in 2019, and then we had to go through like a whole the marriage thing. What was
Oh yeah, the marriage prep or whatever.
no the annulment process. My wife
Oh,
had to go
okay,
through
yeah.
it.
Yeah, that'll
And
that'll slow things down.
yeah, so we didn't actually today at Pentecost is our second or second year anniversary of being Catholic.
Oh, cool.
And so it took yeah, we joined in 2021 officially. But at that point, like I feel like I've been Catholic for 4 years now.
Yeah.
Like it's like I'm like it was one of those things where I'm like, I totally agree. Can I just join? Like,
Yeah,
no,
you
we have
want
to
to be
wait till
fast. That's how
this.
I was. I was like, "Bro, I'm on board. Can I just like sneak in through the back door of the church and just be a Catholic?" Yeah. I was intellectually convinced probably about a year before we officially
Yeah.
joined as well.
Before we were done with RCIA, I was already there. Like,
Oh yeah.
especially once my Mary questions got answered.
Yeah, that's a
Um,
big one. Yeah.
yeah. But for you with your wife, like how did that go with because you guys both did you guys join at the same time or were you
Yes.
first and then she was second? Like how did that work?
So my wife is amazing, and I'm really lucky that she is the way she is because it would have been much more difficult. And like everyone has their various situations, but so when we started dating, I was already full on Anglican. I had moved back to Colorado. That's where we met, and I was like at least Anglican, going to a very Anglo Catholic parish here in our town. Was going to become an Anglican priest, and like at minimum was going to do that, but already was kind of peeking over the door, really looking at orthodoxy hard and like kind of looking at Rome and the whole Pope question and going, uh-oh. So I was already pretty much, I probably at this point, I would say I was past point of no return, even though at that point I wouldn't have seen it
Yeah.
or admitted it. I still had a lot of objections. And so we started dating in the midst of that, but she was on her own journey of coming from a very, and I don't want to say superficial, really solid evangelical background, but starting to do some of the same research I had done in college on like the Jewish perspective of the faith. And so she was going on a journey of that, really widening the scriptures for her. And that's when we met. So the first wrestle was like, she was like, well, yeah, the Jewish stuff and the New Testament being set in context is like change the Bible for me. I'm like, cool, that's step one. Step two is church fathers and,
Yeah, then you're in
and
trouble.
yeah. And she had never heard of that stuff and was like, Anglicanism is weird. Your church is just a bunch of old people. Um, she was nicer than that. Her delivery was nicer than that, but that's and it
Right.
was true, you know. And we kind of had a bit of a tough spot with that when we were first dating. But as I mean, she's really intellectually curious and intelligent. And so as she started like just seeing some of the stuff I was seeing, she was like, "Oh, that does change things. Oh, liturgy is important. Oh, that does work." And so then she kind of caught up. And I was definitely more obsessive about reading and researching than she was. But at some point, we kind of realized that our like methodology of research was similar. And I would show her, here's what I found today. She would breeze through it and go, "Oh gosh, that makes sense. What's that mean?" Or sometimes I would do a deep dive and read a whole book, and she'd be like, "All right, what's the cliff notes? Like, what are we doing?" Um, and so there's probably, I think, dating through engagement, it was kind of an open question of like, we're probably going to be at least Anglican and maybe I'm a priest or more.
Yeah.
And then I would say, so we got married 2020. Our wedding was canceled by COVID, literally. And so we just did like a wedding at a state park with our deacon from our church. And then like everything was shut down. Church was shut down. Everything was shut down for months. And so I'm like, okay, this is our time to like really
Research.
figure this out. Yeah. And so later that year, I think we had both kind of come on board. Pretty much at the same time, but I think when we decided to join the church, I was 100% convinced that it was entirely true and everything was correct that
Yeah.
that the Catholic Church taught. And my wife was at the point where she's like, "I'm not sure about some of these things, but at least it's the best option out there because everyone else is more wrong." So like that's kind of where she was at. She's like, "Well, I can't be Protestant anymore." And like it's kind of confusing to figure out the whole Orthodox Catholic thing at this point for her. So she was like, "I'm going to become Catholic because it's the best option, and God probably doesn't have a good reason to hold that against me." It was kind of where she was falling. And then I think as soon as we became Catholic, now I always say she's a better Catholic than I am because she's like on
I feel the
fire,
same way
leads
with my
discipleship
wife.
groups. Yeah. Women are way better saints than men. We're way
She's
harder to make
praying
holy.
every night, like,
Yeah.
has her prayer book, and I'm like, "Oh, yeah, I forgot to get my rosary in."
Yeah,
Like
exactly. I'm like, "Oh, but I'm so tired now. I'm just gonna
yeah.
doze
Like,
off while I'm
a
trying to
decade and
pretend
a
I'm doing
half, and
Zoom."
I'm asleep.
Yep. Yeah, dude, that's the struggle. I mean, she's up every morning, and now that we had like our daughter is a year and a half, she's trying to get up before our daughter does, and that's an never ending battle of like she
Right.
got up early today, then our daughter gets up earlier, and I'm just like snoring. I'm
Mhm.
not getting up at 5 to, to do
Right.
that. It's hard. Anyways, yeah, that was she was pretty much on board once like she realized there was intellectual weight to it. Like that the journey just went fast for her. But I kind of felt bad though because I was like, for me, this was 4 years of college into about 3.5 years after. So that's like a long
Yeah.
journey for her. It was like she met me, and then we dated, married really fast, and then a year later we're Catholic, and so it was like 2 years from like questioning evangelicalism to full on
Yeah,
Catholic.
it took me a year, I'm gonna say, because when I had learned about, like, and my wife and I joined at the same time too, and so that's why I was asking that
Okay.
question, because I've
Yeah.
heard of and we are in RCIA with couples where it was, like, one of them joining, and I'm like,
Right.
"Gosh, that'd be so
It's
difficult." I'm
tough.
so grateful that my wife was totally on board with me,
Mhm.
and I came out of my office saying the words I don't think she ever thought I would ever say was, "We need to be join the Catholic Church." Um, but, where was I going with that? But yeah, I think it's so important to have a spouse that's on board with you with that.
Mhm.
And
It helps.
I couldn't imagine having a split faith family.
Mhm.
Especially I guess from the husband side of things, right? Like we're supposed to be the spiritual leaders of the house, and it's like, well, your
Right.
wife doesn't agree with you. It's like
Right. Yeah, I know some couples that that's their situation, and it is tough, and I mean, it can be done well. Like, I'm thinking if there's some people I know in particular that, like, have lived out the bulk of raising children that way, and holy people, amazing Catholics, and yeah, I mean, that is, like, their cross to bear in a sense, right? Because even if the person is, like, a really sold out Protestant, they're, like you share a lot, but, like, there's that, like, list of things that you
Yeah.
don't share that's like really difficult. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm mentoring a guy at work that's Catholic, and he's been dating a Protestant girl for a while.
Hmm.
And so now they're ready to get married, but they're having these conversations now, which,
That's
that's
good.
smart on his part.
Yeah.
But he's like, no, the kids are going to be raised Catholic. And
Hmm.
so, and we were talking through it, and he's like, I at least want them to go through First Communion. I'm like, no, you want them to go through confirmation. And he's like, well, why that? I'm like, well,
Hmm.
if they decide to leave the church after that and come back, it's confession and they're back in.
Right.
If you don't do confirmation, they have to go through RCIA. It's a longer
Yeah, it's a
process. And
longer process, right?
he's like, I didn't know that. Okay, good to know. Right.
Yeah. Yep.
But awesome. So you guys joined in 2021,
Hmm.
and for for you with this background of wanting to be a minister and coming into and having training in evangelical churches, what's kind of been the surprising thing about being Catholic that you see once you're actually in the Catholic Church that may I'm not going to say shocked, because
Hmm.
I don't know, there's some things you're like, wow, I had no idea this was going on. But what are
Sure.
some of the good things and some of the bad things that you've kind of seen where you're like, man, why are we doing it this way versus
Sure. Yeah, yeah. I think so. In terms of surprises in a good way, I think. Hmm, I think one of the big things was realizing that some of the things about being Catholic that I was afraid of are not as scary on the ground as they feel when they're just an idea, if that makes sense. Like confession's a good example of that.
yes.
Like I was terrified. I'm like, what? First off, why do I have to do this? Second off, that's weird. This guy is gonna know everything I've ever done. And it just felt like confession was gonna be this big deal and it was gonna be scary and the priest was gonna be like looking down on me. And confession's my favorite sacrament. I go every 2 weeks, like it's a grocery store trip.
Yep.
We have a really good pastor for that too. I mean, he is just amazing. He's like your coach in there, you know. So if you have a good confessor, that's great. But I mean, even when we had a different priest before that, very different style, not my favorite style, but still I went often because I started realizing the power of it. I would have never expected that that would have been like one of my favorite sacraments. I would have been, you know, obviously the Eucharist, but I just really love confession. I feel like it's powerful. And now that I'm on the other side of that, I'm like, man, I don't know how I lived without this. Cause you know, before that, you would like grieve over sin and then just be like, all right, God, I'm sorry about my sin. I hope I'm good. You know, I'll try to repent and figure it
Right.
out. And I never was scrupulous about like wondering, like, because for a long time I didn't believe you could lose your salvation, but it was always wondering if you ever really had it, you know. So it's kind of the same
The
thing, but
Calvin view of
yeah,
the
exactly.
elect.
Yeah, I mean, like as a Calvinist, you struggle with the idea of losing your salvation. It's just thinking you never had it to begin with, instead of oh, I rejected God or something. So, but with confession, it's like, huh, maybe I did something that is bad. Well, I go to confession, problem solved. You know, like it's very,
Mhm.
it's. I realize how grace filled it really is. Obviously in terms of the power of the sacrament, but even in the way that it's set up, like from the outside, it seems like an obstacle to get to God, and then actually experiencing it as a human, it's actually God being so close to us that it's unimaginable how I did it before, because it's like, wait, it's that easy. Like God wants his mercy to be that tangible for me that I just go talk to this guy, tell him what I did, and yeah, he gives me some ideas of how to grow and then absolves me, and you walk out of there as clean as you
Go do
ever
your
could have been.
penance, and yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's perfect. So, I mean, it's realizing the tactile nature of Catholicism and how healing that is as a human. You know, it's very um I think it's like the way that the sacraments are is obviously from a God who knows who he designed human beings to be and knows how to connect to them. And from the outside, it's hard to see that because you're not experiencing it.
Yeah, I agree completely.
Yeah.
The Eucharist, you mentioned that. Was that a big obstacle for you?
The Eucharist, early on it was, because early on I didn't really know what to think about communion, you know. Like I had just taken like the pure memorial view for granted. But as soon as I started falling in love with the church fathers, I pretty instantly like I'm kind of an all or nothing person. So like when I get into something, I like dive 100% in. So
Same
with the
here.
church
Yep.
fathers, I'm just like reading as much as I can, and pretty quickly found like, okay, there's a lot to figure out about some of this other stuff, but they all agree on the Eucharist. And so
Especially Saint Ignatius
yeah.
was the one that blew me away.
Oh yeah, yeah. Yeah, Saint Ignatius. He has a couple of good statements, but the one where he's like, "Yeah, we don't associate with the heretics because they don't pray and they don't confess that the Eucharist is the flesh of our Lord." I'm like,
Yeah,
"Oh, all right,
yeah.
that makes me a heretic in his book."
I
Oops,
had someone get mad at me on my channel because I'd slightly misquoted. I made it a little bit worse than that, but it's
Sure.
basically like if you don't believe that the Eucharist is the body and blood of Christ, you're not a Christian, and that's basically what you don't associate with them.
Right. Yeah. I mean,
That's
there
what he's saying,
is. Yeah.
but I
It's
was
strong language. Yeah.
it is, and I was trying to update it for modern language.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, I think for that reason, I kind of felt like my hands were tied. I'm like, okay, I think I just have to accept this. I did like have to work through how that happens, and then there's the whole like, well, the Orthodox don't label it transubstantiation, but still basically mean the same thing, and then
Hmm.
the Catholics do use that word. So like, I had to wrestle through all of that stuff, and then just like the actual encounter of like looking at this, what looks to be bread, and going, is that really Jesus? I don't know.
Right.
Although I did like looking back on it, I had an odd encounter with the Eucharist. When everything was going on in that discipleship training school, especially after my presentation, when it had been like really tense and I knew I was going to probably leave or get kicked out. And to be honest, it was a bit of both. I was like, I'm leaving. And they're like, good, you don't fit anyway. So it's kind of like saying, like, you're fired. No, I quit.
Yeah.
But anyways, all that was happening. And almost out of spite, but also from a memory from going to Catholic school, there's a parish nearby that had perpetual adoration. And I remember doing that in school when I was in the Catholic school as a young kid, and just like, oh, it smells good in there because the incense. So I went just for a quiet place to pray, get away from all the roommates. Had a couple of roommates that were, we were all rowdy back then. So um, but I just went to adoration, and then I was like, that was really peaceful. And I was like, I don't think that bread is Jesus, but it's kind of cool to pretend that it could be, to think that he's in the room. And so I did that for a couple months. And that's as I was starting to read all this stuff really intently and say, let's look at Catholicism. And at the time I was like, yeah, that doesn't mean anything. And then looking back, I'm like, dude, I was spending a couple hours a week in front of the Eucharist, not convinced that it was the Eucharist, but coming back for some reason. So I think in hindsight, that was probably my first experience of like the graces of the Eucharist in a sense, right?
Yeah.
So it's funny that because I was at the beginning of it, like I hadn't even considered like really looking into that at that point. It was like the very beginning of all of it. So it's funny in hindsight that was almost accompanying what launched me into this journey. So like when you put all the pieces together backwards, I'm like, yeah, anyone could have told me I was going to become Catholic, but at the time I was like, no, not necessarily.
Right.
So
Yeah.
yeah, it's a funny journey.
So what do you see? Because I think I've heard you say this. I can't remember if it was you or someone else I was listening to about um and so let me kind of preface it this way. Like I've been lucky to be on hands-on apologetics on
Oh, cool.
Virgin Most Powerful Radio, and Gary Michuta has me on probably once a month.
Oh, sweet. I
Um
love Gary Michuta.
yeah, he's awesome. And so um yeah, I was kind of shocked when he first reached out to me because I did a whole video on the creation of the Bible. It was like my very first video I ever did.
Oh, okay.
Like, do you want to come on my show? I'm like, who are you? Like, I hadn't even discovered him yet. And I look it up and I'm like, oh
He's like
my
a
word.
monster in the apologetics world too.
Yes. And I'm like, okay. And
Yeah.
so anyway, like on Friday, the topic I was talking about is the role of the laity,
Hmm.
and how I feel in the Catholic Church, the catechism is pretty clear that the laity have a massive role to play in
Mm-hmm.
church,
Mm-hmm.
and we are the body of Christ. Um, but what I've noticed as a Protestant coming in is there's a few people that are involved, but it's not that run things in most parishes, right? But it's
Mm-hmm.
not a tons of volunteers, everybody's doing something, everybody's involved.
Right.
Where like if you go to an evangelical or a Methodist parish,
Mm-hmm.
like everybody's doing something. There's like 85 Bible studies you can go to. There's you know what
Right.
I mean?
A
Like,
lot of programs and activities. Yeah.
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 And but so my question, where I'm getting at with that is I feel like Catholics can learn to have a bigger role to play in their parish life.
Absolutely.
But what do you see? Do you see something like that similar to that where Catholics can really learn from our Protestant brothers and sisters that we can kind of pull in and go, oh, they're doing this really well, and there's a reason they're doing it well.
Mhm.
We should start adopting that as something we should do.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I think that was one of the big challenges. And luckily in our parish, it's going through a period of renewal right now where a lot of that's starting to happen naturally. But I mean, when we first started going, we were going to a very sleepy parish that lot had not been going on that should have been, and a lot of people very dry. And I'm not saying that to be scathing, but it like I think anyone that goes there would be like, "Yep, it was quiet around here." You know, some cobwebs gathering. And I think that in our culture, there's sort of this thing happening just with religious people in general, where there's a lot of people that go because grandma went or because it's like the cultural thing to do, or, oh, I was raised Catholic. They might not know why. They might not have had that intense, personal encounter with Jesus that ignites them. Which I think everyone has to like. It's an important thing to
Yeah.
have, you know. Um, and then in addition to that, I think American Catholics. I don't really know what it would be like in a different country necessarily, but American Catholics I can speak about, we sort of have this idea that Bible studies, that's the Protestant thing. The Bible is kind of the Protestant domain, um, and I think that's to our detriment for sure, because
Hmm.
we know, like, oh yeah, go to the sacraments, get the sacraments, and do that,
Go to mass
and go
and
to
you're good.
mass. Yeah, but we don't know what we do with that. The point of mass is to spiritually fill us and then send us. And the point of the clergy and the church is what Ephesians 4 says. He gave us the apostles, teachers, and prophets for the building up of the saints who go and do the work of the ministry. And so,
Right.
really, the evangelization of the world, your neighborhood, your parish, that's your
That's on
job.
us.
Yeah, that's on us. And I think just even practically, like my parish, we have like 2,000 registered families. We have one priest. He can hardly keep up with the parish,
Wow.
let alone the
We're
community.
about the same size, and I think we
Mhm.
have two priests.
Oh, that's lucky. Yeah.
And because we have a Latin mass and Novus
Oh,
Ordo,
cool.
so we're like we got both, which is pretty fortunate.
That is nice.
We're
Yeah.
lucky. But I can't get my kids to go to Latin mass right now. They're like,
Like,
it's
I don't
so
understand, Dad.
long.
Yeah.
I don't know what they're saying.
Hey, I am team. I love the Latin Mass, but I am team. Let's make the Novus Ordo great again. Like
Yeah,
make it what it should be for sure. My
yeah,
my priest says that a lot. He's like, we could do the Latin Mass, but we could also take all the things we love about it, and they're totally fine to do in the Novus Ordo. People
yep,
just haven't been doing it,
yeah.
and that's yeah. We can. I
Yeah,
think
like
there's a
our
lot you
priest,
can
even
learn from
for the Novus Ordo face, what is it, Rio or
Ad
Orientum?
Orientem.
Yeah,
That's so cool. I
and we
love that.
have we have like communion rails and everything to.
Oh, I'm jealous. I'm
Yeah,
gonna come visit, dude.
it's awesome. You have
I've
open
told
invitation, man.
I've told our pastor, I'm like, because we have one of those. Almost have a church in the round. It doesn't go all the way around, but it's like a semicircle, and the altar is far enough in that, like, it's kind of that shape. But it's just like begging to have altar rails installed. I'm like, that would it would solve some of the communion issues so fast. He's like, I know, but like, you got to be like, the liturgical battles can be real. Our parish is pretty good though, but there's just like, yeah, we don't have Ad Orientem. I wish we did. Like, that'd be my personal preference. But the biggest thing with our current priest, he just celebrates it beautifully and reverently,
Which
and
is great. That's
it's
important.
oh man, you would think that would be like a given, but yeah, I mean,
It's
just
not.
2 years of being Catholic, I've seen some masses that I'm like, and from everything I've heard, it's been much worse in the past.
Yeah, I think we're
Um,
getting better
yeah,
overall.
yeah,
Because one of the things, so when we're talking about a reverent Novus Ordo, when COVID hit, so we started watching masses online, right? And everyone
right.
was broadcasting their masses. Well, at the time, we knew we wanted to move away from Texas at the time.
Mm.
And so we were using that opportunity to watch masses at uh, parishes we might actually move to.
Yeah,
And
get to
so that's
scope it
actually
out a
how
little bit.
we've
Nice.
yeah, and so it's funny because we're like, wow, this is a really bad like this is run really bad. Oh, this one's okay. Like you end up seeing all these different masses and how they're ran, and it's like,
Right,
and I think overall a lot of them were okay. They like I'm not gonna say
right.
they were bad,
Mhm.
But there is a way to do it where it can be done very, very well.
Right.
Um, and that was one thing that shocked me actually was I had no idea about this the Novus Ordo Latin Mass battle.
Oh, yeah.
Like
Yeah,
I
from the
had no clue.
outside, that's, like, not the thing that you're looking into at all, so it just if that was the same way, it just was until I was like, "I'm
Yeah.
pretty sure I'm Catholic," and then it's like, "Oh, we got some issues in
Then
here
you start
too," you
listening
know?
to Taylor Marshall, then I read his
Yeah.
books and I'm like,
Oh,
what is
sure.
going on here?
Right, right. Yeah, it's funny. I mean, it's humans. There are humans in the Catholic Church too, for better or worse, so we tend to make things messy, but I think for me, I didn't have a ton of trouble navigating through that stuff because for me, having been through theological education and having a pretty good grasp on the Bible, and then really spending an obsessive amount of time in the church fathers. Like I kind of joke sometimes with my wife that I should have an honorary master's degree because I probably put in the hours to get one in patristics, but just didn't pay the tuition.
Right.
Um, so like for me, I read Vatican II for the first time, and that like sealed the deal for me. Actually, I was like, wow, this is like reading the early fathers. Whereas the controversy comes from accusing Vatican II of being an infiltration of modernism. But when I read it, having just come out of the fathers, I was like, wait, this is a return
It's
to that.
not. And
Yeah,
I think the problem with Vatican II is the implementation. And
absolutely.
I've heard other
Yes.
people say this too, that it was people were listening to what they weren't reading the documents. They were
Mhm.
listening to what people that supposedly read the documents said the documents were supposed to say and going off that. And
Right.
it's like, man, you read the documents, they're absolutely fabulous.
Yes, they're
Um
really good.
and I think it just went I think the implementation of it was the was the Achilles heel of that, right? And
Father Blake Britton writes a book called Reclaiming Vatican II.
yes, I have
Have
that
you
in
read that?
I haven't read it yet. I got it in my wish list on my Amazon
It's
cart.
really
So
good. I think it should be required reading. I because so I've had 2 experiences with Vatican II in terms of talking with people either on the internet or in person, and neither of them are great. One is Vatican II is where it all went wrong. We got to like either cancel it or like be skeptical of it and do some dirty work to like make it work. And that's sort of like the rad trad camp. And then the other
yep.
one is, oh, Vatican II is amazing. It's when the church finally got with the times and it didn't quite go far enough. And so then like, did either of you read it? And it's funny,
Yeah.
like most of the times you ask that, you'll find people that kind of like you said have gotten their opinion from someone else, um, and not actually read it themselves. And so that's been my I always encourage people like go read Lumen Gentium because go read Nostra Aetate because you immediately realize that the church is not saying like, hey, all are welcome, every religion's great,
It's
kumbaya.
not. It doesn't say that.
Yeah,
And that's the claim you keep getting that I've heard over and
right.
over again. And I read it and I'm going, that's not what it says. It just says there's a possibility, like
Yeah.
what does it say? I can't remember, but it's not even, it's darker than that. It's not, there's a
Yeah, it's
possibility of
grim.
salvation. It's like, well, maybe, possibly, there could be a chance you could have salvation outside the church. It's
Yeah, it's
like,
it's kind of like it's not impossible.
yes,
It shouldn't
that's the
open
way to
this
put it.
hole of like everyone's definitely going to heaven, but it's like invincible ignorance is a real thing. And that's the thing is like anyone that's spent time in the patristics, the fathers, there's evidence of that in the fathers. There were early church fathers who supposed that some of the great philosophers before Christ by reason had come into relationship with God. And so some of them had supposed that even like Plato and Socrates having, discovered through reason the Logos, whom we now know as Christ, would be in communion. And obviously that's a bold claim. I don't even know if I would jump on board with
Yeah.
that, but you have patristic era people,
Making that argument.
making that
That's
argument.
like the
Yeah.
argument for limbo too, right?
Yeah.
Where, um, unbaptized, people that are there are pagans,
Sure. Yeah.
are waiting to the end of times to be able to let into heaven.
Perfect
Um,
natural happiness doesn't sound that bad, dude.
right?
Right?
I know. I'm actually
Yeah.
that's like my next video to do is limbo.
Okay.
So,
Yeah.
um, which that has some interesting implications. I can't even talk tonight.
Implications.
Implications
Yeah.
growing up Church of Christ where it's like you make the choice to be baptized,
Mm,
right?
mhm.
And so like I had a little sister that died when she was 4.
Hmm.
And my family is always of the state of, well, she's in heaven with Jesus. And now that I'm Catholic, I'm like, she's probably in limbo. Like
Sure,
that's
sure.
a big theology thing that I had to work through. I was like, wow, I
Right.
think they're right. Like it logically makes sense. That's probably a thing. The
Sure.
bosom of Abraham or
Right,
Sheol.
right. Yeah. Well, then, like, the thing with that view, at least, especially with that, because, like, there's like an open debate on like to what degree medieval view of limbo outside of the patriarchs is true, but like the view of limbo, especially for, like you said, the bosom of Abraham. I mean, like that makes so much sense of the Old Testament and Sheol and some of Jesus's parables, and it seems reasonable, right? And then First Peter, or is it Second Peter, talking about when Christ descends into hell
Hmm.
and liberates the captives, that it's those patriarchs and people from before, and then to extend that logic that there could be some sense of that now. I haven't done a ton of research on that though, actually, because it's one of those things where I'm like, yeah, that's not the battle I'm finding myself fighting, so I haven't
Yeah.
had to deep dive on it yet.
No,
Um,
and
yeah,
for me, it's one of those topics that came up that I was like, wow, this is an interesting way to look at it.
it is.
Um,
Yeah,
and it's another Catholic twist on something I thought I knew.
right.
you know?
And then no surprise, it always makes a lot of sense. You're like, man, there's an answer. That did you have this moment? This is a question I have for you guys. I had this moment when I started like getting to the point where I'd have a question like, well, what do the Catholics say about this? And then internally, I'd go, they probably have a really good answer. And then I'd look it up and go, yeah, that's a really good answer. Did you kind of
No,
have a similar experience?
100%. So, like, I know your mom kind of grew up Church of Christ,
Yeah,
but I was deep in it, and especially with my grandfather being a preacher.
yeah,
And Catholicism is like the Church of the Antichrist, right? Like
yep.
that's what I
That's what they.
grew up believing.
Yeah.
So, and like my earliest memory of anything Catholic was telling my grandma when I was 5, my nana, I was like, she was there at her house, and I was watching Notre Dame football, and I'm 5 or 6, right? I'm young, and I'm like, I
Mm.
want to play for Notre Dame when I grow up. And she's like, you can't play for them; they're Catholic.
Oh,
And like, I have no idea what Catholic is, but I still remember that
you're like,
memory.
oh,
I was
must be
like,
bad. Yeah,
yeah, you know. So,
that's funny.
but yeah, I think there was that happened all the time where
Mhm.
I would look at the Protestant argument, right? And I would read it and like, come on, convince me, convince me, convince me. And then I'd read the Catholic argument and I'm like, no, they're right again. This
Yeah.
is awful. And it
Yep.
really was a struggle for me. Like I always say, I grudgingly came into the Catholic Church because it kept making sense. It kept being
Yep.
proved right. It kept like everything just kept falling into place. And then the big one, like once I figured out agreeing that Peter was the first pope
Mhm.
and researching that, then it was like, okay, this other
Yeah.
stuff, I'll figure it out. Let's just start
The
RCIA.
papacy is the end game because like, if you become convinced of the papacy, then you're like everything else kind of necessarily falls into place just on the basis of the papal claims, right?
Yep.
That was kind
Yep.
of my experience because I mean, especially towards the last like 2 years, I would say of my journey when I was like at least Anglican, but like looking over the other fences, I really desperately would have preferred to have been convinced of orthodoxy. I love the East. I love the aesthetic of it,
Hmm.
the Jesus prayer, the spirituality of it, even the way they formulate things. I mean, a
Do
lot
you
of that you
have
can
any
do.
Byzantine Catholic churches around in
We
your area?
don't. We don't. We have one Orthodox church 30 minutes north of us, but no Byzantine Catholic stuff. So I actually haven't been to a divine liturgy ever, but I've watched many of them, and yeah, I remember even saying this. I was like, I would love to be Orthodox. Like I'm like, but there was this nagging thing that I was like, but I have to like, I can't just become Orthodox and then figure out the Pope and then jump again. I was like,
Yeah.
I got to just figure out this Pope thing, and
Yep. That's kind of what
yeah.
it laid out to me was okay. They both agree on the Eucharist.
Hmm.
And that was a big thing. And then it's like, I got to figure this Pope thing out
Hmm.
because that's the deciding factor of which
Yep.
way I go. Um, yeah, no, and there is one here in Greenville.
Oh, cool.
That it's a small parish, but we do stuff with them occasionally. Our parish does. Um, and I've gone to confession there, and it's face
Mm.
to face. There's no like behind
Mhm.
the like you sit in a room and talk with the priest. It's like,
Yep.
yeah. Um,
That's cool though.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. So I have to go. Like I haven't gone yet, but I need to go. That'd be really cool to see how that
Yeah,
is.
it's on my bucket list too. And I maybe if I had one here, this wouldn't be true, but I am pretty confident that if we had a Byzantine Rite Catholic parish near us, I'd probably be going there just because. And not like some people do that because they're like, oh, my Novus Ordo Mass is garbage and this is better, and that's fine. But for me, I genuinely like really love the East. I really being someone who's really hyper intellectual, like overthinker, the West makes sense in that that's kind of how the West works. We like over
Hmm.
formulate everything sometimes.
Yep.
But the East is kind of healing for me in that sense because I'm like, oh, it's a mystery. They
Yeah.
relish in that a little better. Um, but yeah, yeah, that was the. It's so funny looking back because the papacy became like the obsessive thing. I was like, ah, and then you get to the minutia of it, and you're looking at the same evidence, and the Orthodox are going, no, it means the opposite of what you guys are saying. And there's like that thing. I had to look into some really obscure, like ancient history and like start to read the Bible and see is there anything here that's like pointing this way. So that was probably the biggest wrestle at the very end because at that point I was like, I'm either gonna drive 30 minutes and be Orthodox or I'm gonna be Catholic.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, awesome. I know we've been on for a little over an hour now, but I think this was great. I love talking with you. I knew this was going to be a good conversation just from
Oh
watching
yeah.
your channel and stuff. So I really do appreciate you coming on. What do you
Yeah,
got
thanks
going
for
on in
having me
your
on.
channel?
Oh man. We are trying to plan a couple interviews with some people in person around here. I had said one of them was going to come out and it's been rescheduled a couple times, but we're trying to get an interview out with some of the people from our local Catholic school to kind of talk about Catholic education. So that can be coming out soon. I'm also trying to schedule, and I guess I'll put this out there because I know I'm going to do it. It's just a matter of when. I had bingo cards made for anti-Catholic bingo. And so the idea being that there's a bunch of different bingo cards that I have that are virtual. We can play like a virtual bingo game and like watch a sermon from someone that's going to be obviously anti-Catholic and then play bingo with it. So I'm going to do that at some point.
That
Those are the
is
most immediate plans.
awesome.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
love that. I did I was on oh, what is that channel? Oh, I can't even think of the name of the channel right now. But we did Bible trivia between converts and cradle Catholics.
Oh, okay. Cool.
It was awesome. Of course, the converts
I was going to
won.
say that was a stacked deck, wasn't it? The converts were probably slaying that.
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
awesome.
Yep.
But yeah, no, that's hilarious because it's all the same arguments, so it's easy to
Yeah.
make a bingo card.
It was not difficult, and I, like, kinda tested it with one of the sermons I think that we're gonna use for the first round, and I was like, "Wow, depending on which card you get, like, you might win in the first, like, 20 minutes?" So,
Hmm.
what I'll probably do is, I'll probably announce it here soon. I was gonna actually try and do it this weekend, and then it just didn't
Life
work out in terms
happens.
of getting the tech figured out, and then, obviously, yeah, my wife's in a play and stuff right now, so I was like, "Well, got to make this work luckily though."
Yeah,
But I'll probably announce it on my channel and it's either going to be something where there's a bunch of different Catholic creators on. So like I'll have you on and some other
yeah, I'd love to
people.
come on.
But yeah, once I figure out the timing on it and can get the tech side figured out, I'll announce that. And if we can't fill the spots, then I'll get a couple people like just viewers and stuff who want to come on maybe too. We'll just do it over Zoom or something. So yeah, that's
Cool.
probably the most immediate thing. But
Yeah,
I
if you
think it'll be
need,
cool.
let me know. I'm totally down for that. So I'll definitely clear my schedule for that. It'd be fun.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I'm hoping like this next month too, because our schedule clears up a little bit. Summers are always crazy, and my content slows way down, and then I see my view count not going up as fast either. So then the YouTube creator like
I had that
in me,
panic
yeah,
too.
yeah,
Yeah, no, it's a thing about being YouTube here.
yeah.
But awesome. Well, I'm gonna definitely, guys, I'm gonna put the link for Drew's channel in the description below. So check his stuff out. Absolutely fabulous content. I love your conversations with your Protestant friends.
Thanks, man. I appreciate that.
And
Yeah.
like even the your mom's conversion story, we didn't even touch on that,
Oh yeah.
which was absolutely a fabulous conversation you had with your
Thank you.
mom,
Yeah.
and then your wife and mom be ganging up on you there towards the end.
It's bound to happen, right? Yeah, it's bound to happen.
But that
So
was absolutely fabulous. So, but yeah, check out his channel. Give this one a thumbs up and like and subscribe. And we'll talk to y'all later. Appreciate it, Drew.
yeah, thanks, Brian.